The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of sleep, the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket and lets you drift. This was the silence of a room that didn't know what to do with him, a silence that paused when he moved and resumed when he stopped. He could feel it pressing against his skin, the way water does when you've been submerged too long, that low, constant pressure that tells you something is wrong with the atmosphere. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was white, not painted white, not stained tile white, but a white that seemed to generate its own light from somewhere inside its surface. It hummed at a frequency he could feel in the back of his teeth. He blinked. He tried to sit up. His body didn't answer the way it should. His left arm moved first, which surprised him, because he'd been right-handed his whole life. He knew that the way you know your own name, without having to think about it. He pressed his palm flat against the surface beneath him and pushed, and the world tilted sideways, and for a moment he just sat on the edge of whatever he'd been lying on and looked at his hands. They were wrong. Not wrong the way a hand looks after a bad burn, not wrong the way swelling changes the architecture of familiar skin, wrong in a deeper way. The right hand had 3 parallel ridges running across the back of it, raised and pale, the color of something that had never seen sun. The ridges ran from his knuckles to his wrist and disappeared under the sleeve of a garment he didn't recognize. When he turned the hand over, the palm was his same whorls, same crease at the base of his ring finger, but the wrist had a port of some kind worked into the skin. Not stitched in, grown in. The skin had sealed around it the way skin seals around a piercing that's been there long enough, like it had always been there. He sat with that for a long moment. The room resolved around him slowly. It was large and mostly empty, the walls made of the same self-illuminating material as the ceiling. In one corner there was a low piece of furniture that might have been a chair if the designer had only heard chairs described second-hand. Against the far wall, a panel of controls sat dark and dormant, covered in symbols he couldn't read. There was a single window. Through it he could see a sky that was the wrong color, not blue, not gray, not any transitional shade between them, but a deep violet green that shifted as he watched, the way the sky shifts in the minutes before a tornado. He stood up. His legs held. He walked to the window and put one hand against the glass, and the glass was warm, which was wrong. Glass should be cool, and outside there was a city. A city of curved towers and elevated walkways and vehicles that moved without wheels, suspended in that violet-green air. A city that was not any city on Earth. He pressed his forehead to the glass. He said out loud to no one, "Okay." That was when the door opened. She came in slowly, the way you approach something that might bolt. She was tall, taller than him by nearly a foot, which put her close to 7 feet, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told not to startle him. Her skin was a deep blue-gray. Her eyes were amber with pupils that contracted sideways when the light hit them, and she wore a uniform of pale fabric that shifted color slightly as she moved. She was carrying something, a tray, the alien equivalent of a tray, flat and smooth with small portions of food arranged on it, and she set it down on the low chair-like furniture and looked at him. She said something. The sound of it was musical and layered, 2 tones at once, and he understood none of it. He said, "I don't understand you." She said something else. Her tone changed. She gestured to the tray of food, then to him. He crossed to the tray. He looked at the food. Some of it was identifiable, something that looked like a grain, something that looked like a sliced fruit, something amber-colored that might have been some kind of protein. He picked up the grain and ate some. It tasted like nothing, like the memory of flavor rather than flavor itself. She watched him eat with the focused attention of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. After a while she left. He ate everything on the tray. Then he went back to the window and watched the city move through its alien morning. He knew 3 things about himself. He knew that his name was Jonas Reyes, that he had been born in Corpus Christi, Texas on a July morning during a rainstorm, and that he had a wife. He knew her face the way he knew the sky. Dark hair that she kept pulled back on work days and let loose on weekends. A laugh that started small and grew until it took over her whole body. A habit of reading with her feet tucked under her and a cup of tea she never finished. He knew her name. He knew her completely. He knew nothing else about his life before the white ceiling. That knowledge sat in him like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were strange and cold. On the third day, the alien he'd started calling the doctor tried to run tests. She came in with instruments he didn't recognize and gestured to the table he'd woken up on, and he sat on it because he was trying to be cooperative. She held up a small device and pointed it at him, and he let her do it. When she touched the port in his wrist, he felt a brief sharp cold that moved up his arm and faded, and she made a sound that might have been satisfaction. She held up her hands then, fingers spread. He counted, 6 fingers on each hand, the extra one seated between what would be a human index finger and thumb. She spread them and closed them slowly, watching him watch her. He spread his own hands, 10 fingers. He spread them and closed them. She made the sound again. Then she reached to a surface nearby and picked up something and set it on the table between them. It was a small physical puzzle interlocking pieces of some smooth material, roughly the complexity of a child-shaped sorter. She pointed to it. She looked at him. He picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He had it solved in 40 seconds. She went very still. He set the completed puzzle down. He looked at her. He said, "Do you have a harder one?" Whatever was in his tone communicated something, because she reached immediately and produced a second puzzle, this one considerably more complex. He worked it for 2 minutes and 20 seconds. She was making rapid notes on a device by the time he set it down. He said, "Harder." She left and came back with a third one, and the third one was not a puzzle designed for children. It had moving internal components and a locking mechanism that required force to be applied in a specific sequence. He sat with it for 11 minutes, which was the longest he'd been quiet since he woke up, turning it slowly, listening to the way the components moved against each other. He solved it from the sound. He'd always been good at that, at understanding the internal logic of mechanical things by the way they spoke. He didn't know where that knowledge came from. He just knew it was his. When he set the third puzzle down, she was staring at him. He looked at the port in his wrist and then at her, and he said, "Why am I here?" She didn't understand the words, but she understood the question. She left again and came back with someone else. He was shorter than her, stockier, and wore different clothing, darker, more formal. His eyes were the same sideways pupil amber, but his skin was lighter gray, and he moved with the particular confidence of someone who controlled things. He came and stood in front of Jonas the way you stand in front of something you own, and he studied him, and he smiled. His smile had too many teeth for Jonas to find it reassuring. This one, Jonas decided, was going to be a problem. Over the following days, they settled into something like a routine. The doctor came in the mornings and ran her tests. She was always careful and she was always calm, and she seemed genuinely concerned when Jonas flinched or showed discomfort, which he did less and less as the days passed, and his body became more predictable to him. She brought books, not human books, alien texts, but with images, and she would point to an image and say its name and wait for him to repeat it, and that was how he began to acquire language. He was quick at it. Quicker than she expected, he could tell from the way her notes accelerated. She brought him physical tasks, too, and those he mastered faster than the language. She brought a paddle and a small ball one morning, clearly uncertain of the gesture, and he understood immediately and demonstrated that he knew exactly what the game was. He had played it in a college common room at 2 in the morning to avoid studying. He remembered that now, a flash of white fluorescent light and plastic table and laughter. He served to himself against the wall for 20 minutes while she watched. She watched the way you watch something that doesn't match the model you're working from. He served her the ball. She caught it on pure reflex. She looked at it in her six-fingered hand. He held up his paddle and nodded. She played him for half an hour. She was not good. He let her think she was. This became its own kind of lesson, though not the one she thought she was teaching. Jonas learned, rally by rally, how much he was capable of concealing when he wanted to. He could move faster than she expected. He'd known that from the second day when he'd walked to the window and felt the peculiar lightness of a body built better than the original. He could process the arc of her returns before her paddle had finished its swing. The neural restructuring Polidori would later describe had made him faster in the mind as well as the muscle. The puzzle logic of the game resolved itself almost before play began. He kept the rallies close. He let her win enough that she came back the next day with the paddle ready, which told him something important. She was capable of enjoying herself in this room with him. She was not just a technician running tests. She was a person, sitting across a table from a person, and that distinction mattered. It was the first crack in the functional assumption that defined his situation, the assumption that he was a subject and everyone else was staff. He filed that crack carefully. The short one came back at the end of the second week and spent a long time talking to the doctor while Jonas sat at the window and watched the alien city. He'd been watching it long enough to start understanding its rhythms. When the air traffic was heavy, when the elevated walkways were crowded, when the towers shifted their surface texture in response to temperature changes. The city was beautiful in the way that very complex things are beautiful. He watched it the way he used to watch machines. He could hear the short one's tone, even if he couldn't yet catch all the words. The tone was the same in every language. This is mine. What is its value? What can it do? He turned from the window. He said, in the alien language he'd been assembling word by word like a puzzle, "You are talking about me." They both looked at him. The doctor's expression was something close to apology. The short one's expression was closer to delight. Jonas looked at the short one. He said carefully in the new language, "What do you want?" The short one laughed. He said, and Jonas caught enough of it now to follow, that the question was backwards. The question was not what he, Polidori, wanted. The question was what Jonas Reyes was capable of, and whether that capacity had limits, and how those limits might be useful. Jonas filed the name away, Polidori. He said, "Everything has limits." Polidori said, "Not you, not what we've made of you." The doctor looked out the window. She didn't look at either of them when she said, quietly, the word that meant, enough. On the 19th day, they took him outside. The doctor walked beside him and Polidori walked ahead, and there were two others with them who weren't introduced, who stayed at a distance that Jonas recognized as the distance of a guard rather than a companion. The air outside was thinner than he was used to, and the gravity was slightly lower. He'd noticed that from the first day, the way everything felt slightly lighter than it should, the way walking required slightly less effort than his muscles remembered needing. In the lower gravity, he moved faster and lighter than he'd moved in the controlled environment of his room. One of the guards noticed. He saw the guard recalibrate. Polidori took him through the city the way a museum docent takes you through exhibits. He pointed to things. He named them. He explained. He was enjoying himself enormously. Jonas could tell this was the enjoyment of someone demonstrating the sophistication of their civilization to a mind they've judged inferior. He pointed to their transit infrastructure. He pointed to their energy generation systems. The towers, Jonas understood now, were partly antenna, converting the atmospheric electricity of this planet into usable power, which was elegant, and which Jonas had mostly worked out from watching the tower surfaces through his window on storm days. He didn't tell Polidori he'd worked it out. He listened, and he nodded at appropriate intervals, and he filed everything. The archive was their version of a museum, a vast stepped building at the center of the city, and inside it the history of the Vreth Collective was recorded in image and object, and something between the two. Polidori walked him through 3 floors. He showed him the wars because there had been wars, many of them, before the collective unified, and he showed him the weapons. He showed him the transition period, when the last dissident world was absorbed. He showed him images of species who had resisted and failed. Jonas looked at all of it. He looked at it very carefully. He looked at the weapons displays the way an engineer looks at anything designed to solve a problem, with interest in the logic of the design, the constraints it answered, the assumptions it was built on. He noted where each weapon required specific biological attributes to operate. He noted the control interfaces. He noted, in the display of the last absorbed world, that resistance had been organized but not networked, centralized command, which meant the collective had needed only to remove the center to collapse the whole. He made no notes. He had no paper. He put everything in the same place he put the language, and the city's rhythms, and the paddle and ball dynamic. He put it where it could be found later when he needed it. Polidori mistook his silence for awe. That was fine. The last floor of the archive contained something Polidori walked him toward with particular satisfaction, a long hall of species profiles. Every world the collective had encountered, documented. Polidori moved them past the profiles of absorbed worlds with the brisk indifference of someone walking through a section of the museum they've already memorized. He slowed only at the ones marked uncontacted, and he stopped entirely in front of one. Jonas looked at the display and felt a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Blue and white, photographs taken from orbit, recognizable from any elementary school classroom, from any documentary opening, from every moment of his childhood when someone wanted to establish scale. The continents, the cloud cover, the specific blue of an ocean he had swum in. Polidori said, "This is why you are here, not you specifically, the species." Jonas said, "What does that column mean, the one on the right?" Polidori's teeth appeared. Threat assessment. Jonas looked at the numbers. The Vreth Collective ranked threat assessments on a scale Jonas had learned was 1 to 9. Most species on the display were ranked 2 or 3. A few were ranked 4. One was ranked 5 and had a notation beside it that suggested it had since been absorbed. Humanity was ranked 6. Polidori said, "You are the highest-ranked uncontacted species in this sector. We have debated what to do with you for many of your years." Jonas looked at the column for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands, the 3 ridges on the right hand, the port in his wrist, the skin that had been put back together better than it had been before. He said, "And what did you decide?" Polidori said, "We decided to understand you first." He said it like it was a kindness. Jonas looked back at the threat assessment column. He looked at the 6. He thought they should have ranked it higher. He said nothing. He followed Polidori back to the transit vehicle. He watched the city pass by. In his room that night, he sat at the window for a long time. The city moved through its dark hours with the efficiency of something that had been built to run without human uncertainty. Every light timed, every transit arc calculated, nothing left to chance or feeling. Beautiful and airless. He put his hand on the window. He thought about his wife. He remembered the weight of her, the specific gravity of the space between them in a room. The way she'd put her hand over his on a car seat in the dark, not for any reason, just because his hand was there and hers wanted to be near it. He remembered a night, and this memory arrived fully formed where others were still fragments, when they'd had a bad fight. One of those fights that sits in the room for days after, and she had gone to bed without him, and he'd sat in the kitchen, and he'd looked at his own hands for a long time, feeling the weight of the choices he'd made. And then he'd gotten up and gone and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she'd reached out without waking up and put her hand over his, and the whole weight of the night lifted. He pressed his forehead to the glass. He said very quietly, "I'm going to figure this out." The next morning the doctor came in for the usual tests, and when she reached for his wrist, Jonas put his other hand over hers. She went still. He had learned enough of the language now to be careful with it. He said, "What did you put in me?" She looked at him, her pupils contracted. She was deciding something. She said, "You were damaged, catastrophically. The original body," she paused, searching for a word, "was not viable. We repaired what we could. What we could not repair, we replaced. What we replaced, we improved." Jonas said, "What does the port do?" She said, "It allows interface with our systems, data transfer, monitoring, control." He let that last word sit between them for a moment. He said, "Does Polidori have control?" She looked out the window. He had his answer. "What are you?" he asked, not hostile, genuinely curious. She said, "A physician." He said, "And what am I?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You were supposed to be a proof of concept, that the process worked, that it could be done," she said. "You were not supposed to be you." He sat with that. He said, "How long have I been here?" "By your time measurement," she said, 14 months. 14 months. He put that number in the same place he'd put the threat assessment number. He looked at it from all sides. He said, "Is my wife alive?" The doctor said, "I do not know. We did not surveil your individual before." She paused again. "We were not watching that specifically." Jonas nodded. He looked at his hands. He said, "Thank you for telling me." She looked at him with those amber eyes, pupils sideways, and he understood that she was afraid. Not of him, or not only of him. Afraid of Polidori. Afraid of what she'd agreed to be part of. He recognized that particular fear because he'd seen it in himself in the kitchen in the dark that night, looking at his own hands. He said, "I am not going to hurt you." She said, "That is not what I am afraid of." He said, "I know." On the 20th day, Polidori came alone. He brought with him a small object, and he set it on the table between them, and he sat down and looked at Jonas with the expression of a man who has decided to be honest, because he thinks honesty will serve him better than the alternative. He said, "We are going to send you back." Jonas looked at the object on the table. It was a necklace, a thin chain with a charm. He recognized it with a shock that moved through him like voltage. He reached for it before he'd consciously decided to, and he held it in his palm, and the metal was cold and his hand was warm, and the memories hit him all at once. Her standing in their living room in the yellow kitchen light. The necklace in a small box. His birthday, he'd forgotten it in the chaos of his job, and she'd remembered. She always remembered. She'd smiled when he held it up to the light and said it was the most impractical gift he'd ever received, because he never wore jewelry, and she'd said that was fine. He could keep it in his pocket, and he'd had it in his pocket the night he died. The night he died. He sat very still, with the necklace in his palm. Polidori said, "You understand now." Jonas said, "Say what you came to say." Polidori spread his six-fingered hands. He said, "The process that rebuilt you also changed you. You are faster, stronger, more durable. Your neural architecture has been restructured. You process information at a rate no unmodified human can match. The port in your wrist gives you access to our systems when in range. You are, in the technical language of our research division, the most effective thing we have ever produced from organic material." He paused. He said, "We want to send you back to Earth. You will report what you find. You will provide data. You will help us understand the threat." Jonas turned the necklace in his hands. The charm caught the self-illuminating light of the wall. He said, "You want me to spy on my own people?" Polidori said, "We want you to ensure that when the collective arrives at your planet, and we will arrive, this is not a threat, it is a trajectory. These things are determined by mathematics. The transition is peaceful, efficient, without unnecessary loss." Jonas said, "You want me to help you conquer Earth?" Polidori said, I want you to help us do it without destroying it. He said it the way you say a reasonable thing. The way people say reasonable things about unreasonable actions, because they've been living with the action long enough that the reasonableness of it feels self-evident. Jonas looked at him for a long time. He said, "How long do I have before the collective arrives?" Polidori said, "By your measurement, perhaps 12 of your years. The political process of approval takes time even for us." 12 years, Jonas filed that number. He said, "And if I agree, what guarantees do I have?" Polidori said, "The continued health of your planet and its people." Jonas said, "That's not a guarantee. That's a threat with better vocabulary." Polidori's teeth appeared. He said, "You are very quick." Jonas said, "I know." He looked at the necklace one more time. He closed his hand around it. He said, "I'll do it." Polidori looked satisfied in the way that people look satisfied when they've gotten the thing they wanted and haven't yet understood what it cost them. The next 4 days were preparation. The doctor came and ran more tests, thorough ones, and she was careful and she was quiet. And on the last day she sat across from him and she said, without looking at him, "The port, the control function that Polidori described, it works bidirectionally." Jonas waited. She said, "From your side with the correct access sequence, you can use it to interface with any Vreth system in range, not just receive, send." She set a small physical object on the table. It was a sequence of symbols. She set it there and she looked at the window. Jonas picked it up. He memorized the sequence in one pass. The neural restructuring Polidori had mentioned made him faster at this than he'd been before, and he'd been good before. He said, "Why are you telling me this?" She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Because I have been watching you for 32 days, and because what we are about to do to your planet is not medicine." She stood up, she collected her instruments, she moved toward the door. At the door she paused, she said, "The ping pong. You were letting me win." He said, "Not every time." Something in her face moved that might have been the alien version of a smile. Then she walked out. He looked at the sequence in his hand. He put it in the same mental pocket where he kept his wife's face, and the threat assessment number, and the 14 months, and the 12 years. He put it there with all the other things Polidori had given him without knowing he was giving them away. Then he lay back on the table and let them prepare him for transit. He came back to Earth on a Tuesday. He knew it was a Tuesday because the transit deposited him 3 miles outside a town in New Mexico, and the first person he saw was a woman walking a dog who told him it was Tuesday when he asked, and then asked if he was all right because he looked like he'd been in some kind of accident. He said he had. She gave him water from a bottle in her bag, and he drank it standing on the side of a dirt road with his eyes closed, tasting it. Just water. It tasted like everything. He spent 60 days being careful. He moved slowly. He kept his head down. He found work with his hands because his hands were better than they'd ever been, and physical labor let him think without arousing attention. He found a room to rent. He watched the news with a hunger that felt almost physical. 14 months of deprivation hadn't made him love Earth less. It had made him love it the way you only love things after you've understood what their loss would mean. He sent the compliance signals Polidori expected. Location confirmed. Status nominal. Asset operational. He sent them from burner devices he bought with cash, from coordinates that verified him in the region he was supposed to be in, and he sent them with the specific cadence Polidori's system expected. Not too prompt, not too slow, exactly the rhythm of a man doing what he'd agreed to do without thinking about it too hard. It was, he reflected, not so different from the ping pong. Give them what they expect to see, keep the rest invisible. He started making contacts. He was careful about that too. He moved through the early months the way the city moved in the alien archive, not loudly, not with a single point of command, but distributed. He drove through 3 states in the first month alone, taking long routes on roads that required cash tolls, staying in motels that didn't ask for ID if you paid up front. He visited libraries. He read everything he could find about signal theory, network architecture, interstellar monitoring systems, the speculative kind that serious physicists published in journals nobody's grandmother read, and cross-referenced it with everything he was pulling from the port in those rare moments when the breath monitoring reach passed close enough to allow interface. He had a notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing he'd bought at a gas station outside El Paso, and he filled it in a code that wasn't a code so much as a private shorthand, the kind of notation that made sense only inside one specific mind. He filled 2 more notebooks by March. He kept them in an aluminum case in the back of a second-hand pickup truck he paid cash for, and he drove that truck the way he used to walk through the alien city, with attention, cataloging. He had been rebuilt, he understood, into something extraordinary by the logic of the breath. Faster, stronger, able to process more information at once, able to hold and organize more in memory than any unmodified human. What Polidori had not understood, what the threat assessment's logic had no room for, was that none of those advantages were foreign to what Jonas had been before. They were amplifications. He had always been this person, slightly, the one who listened to the inside of a locked box and heard how it wanted to open. The restructuring hadn't built something new. It had turned the volume up on something that was already there. Which meant that what Polidori had built, when he'd built his perfect asset, was a more effective version of exactly the kind of person you least want against you. The irony would have been funny if the stakes had been anything other than what they were. He was sitting in a diner in Tucson, eating scrambled eggs and watching a news broadcast about a tech company acquiring a satellite network, when he first saw the signal signature he recognized. Not on the broadcast, in the broadcast's metadata, a compression artifact that shouldn't have been there, a ghost pattern in the digital signal that matched exactly the monitoring cadence of a Vreth secondary node. They were watching the broadcast infrastructure. Of course they were. If you were monitoring a civilization and you had the ability to interface with its communication networks, you didn't just watch from outside, you used what was there. He paid for the eggs and left a cash tip, and sat in the truck for 20 minutes with his hands on the steering wheel. Then he drove to Albuquerque. He'd been an engineer before, systems engineer, the kind who looked at large complex problems and found the points where a small adjustment produced a large outcome. He'd been good at it. He was better at it now. The neural restructuring didn't just make him faster, it made the patterns visible in ways they hadn't been before, the causal chains longer and clearer, the second and third order effects easier to model. He found a woman named Dr. Chen who worked at a research facility outside Albuquerque and who had, in the course of her work, encountered something she wasn't supposed to encounter, a signal, an artifact in certain frequency ranges that didn't match any known source. She'd written it up, and her write-up had been quietly filed, and she'd been quietly told to focus on other things. He found her because he was looking for people who were already looking. He sat across from her in a coffee shop and he said, "You found something." She looked at him, she said, "Who are you?" He said, "Someone who knows what it is." He told her enough. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He showed her the port in his wrist. He let her run tests. He gave her the access sequence the doctor had given him, and he watched her understand what it was and what it meant, and the way her face changed in that moment was one of the most important things he ever witnessed. Fear, and then calculation, and then something harder and more durable than either. She said 12 years. He said, maybe less if they accelerate the political process. We can't count on 12. She said, what do they want? He said, they want efficient conquest, they want us compliant. He paused. The threat assessment, they ranked us a 6. She said, out of what? He said, 9. She looked at him, why aren't we higher? He said, because they've never seen us when we know we're being watched. She absorbed that. She said, "What's the first step?" He said, "Map what we're dealing with. I've been pulling data through the port when the monitoring network is in range, but I'm only getting pieces. I need someone who can help me build the architecture from the pieces." She said, "That's me." He said, "I know, that's why I'm here." There was a pause. Outside the coffee shop window, Albuquerque went about its morning, a city entirely unaware that two people in a corner booth were beginning the longest sustained act of resistance in the history of Earth's contact with a foreign intelligence. A woman walked past with a stroller. A man unlocked a storefront. A pigeon landed on the curb outside and looked in through the glass for a moment and then lost interest. Dr. Chen said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why are you doing this?" Not the general answer, the actual answer. He looked at her. He said, "I have a wife. I spent 9 years missing her and finding her again. They thought taking me apart and putting me back together would make me useful to them. What it actually did was give me 14 months to study them and 9 years of motive." He paused. "What they built when they built me was someone who knows exactly what he's protecting and has no intention of letting it go." She nodded slowly. She said, "Okay, show me what you've got." He took out the notebooks. That was the beginning. He didn't become a hero the way heroes happen in stories, with a single moment of clarity and a trumpet section. He became a problem. Specifically, he became the most expensive problem the Vreth Collective had ever created for itself, and he became it methodically over 8 years, in the way that an engineer becomes a problem, by understanding the system better than the people running it. The work itself was unglamorous and relentless. There were weeks that felt like nothing moved. There were months that felt like backsliding. There was a period in year 5 when 2 of the people Dr. Chen had brought in decided the whole enterprise was delusional, that the port in Jonas's wrist was a trauma response, an elaborate wound he'd built an architecture of meaning around, and that the alien monitoring system they'd been mapping for 2 years was a coincidence of signal patterns in deep space telemetry that a grieving, rebuilt man had misread. They weren't unkind about it, they left clean. Jonas didn't argue with them. He understood the position. 14 months in a white room with self-illuminating walls doesn't leave evidence you can hand to someone else. He had the port, but the port was biological, and biological things can be misread as medical anomalies. He had the access sequences, but sequences are just symbols, and symbols need context. He had his word, and his word was, "I died on a sidewalk and woke up somewhere else, and the sky was the wrong color." What he had that was not susceptible to doubt was the data that kept coming through. Not continuously. The monitoring nodes drifted in and out of range, and the windows were unpredictable, but they came, and the data was consistent, and Dr. Chen was not the kind of person who misread consistent data. After year 3, she had stopped qualifying her language. She stopped saying, "What appears to be," and "what might be," and started saying what it was, in the flat, certain tone of someone describing a weather system that's arrived and cannot be wished back. Year 6 was when Jonas found the maintenance logs. He hadn't been looking for maintenance logs. He'd been tracing a communication pathway between 2 nodes that behaved differently from the others. A latency spike that didn't fit the geometry of the network as they'd modeled it, which meant either the model was wrong or there was a node they hadn't mapped. He followed the latency back through 3 relay points and found, in the gap between 2 legitimate signal paths, what was clearly a scheduled maintenance record. A log of automated system checks, node health reports, predicted failure windows, and, critically, repair dispatch records showing when and where Vreth maintenance was scheduled to occur. He stared at it for a long time. Then he called Dr. Chen at 11:30 at night and said, "I need you to look at something." The maintenance logs told them 2 things. The first was a minor tactical gift. Knowing when scheduled maintenance was occurring meant knowing when the network would be running reduced redundancy, which was useful for the cascade timing. The second was something larger and stranger. The logs showed that 3 of the 7 cascade points Jonas had already identified had been flagged in the Vreth's own system as elevated failure probability due to component age. They hadn't been replaced because the collective's bureaucratic maintenance cycle moved slowly across this distance. The network they were planning to take down was, in part, already planning to take itself down. They just needed to help it along at the right moment. Dr. Chen looked at this data for a very long time. She said, "They built something elegant and then forgot to maintain it." Jonas said, "Every empire eventually does." She looked at him. He looked at his hands, the ridges, the port, the evidence of being rebuilt. He said, "They're very good at beginnings. I don't think they've had a lot of practice with endings." They met in basements and rented facilities and borrowed server rooms and the backs of vehicles in desert parking lots at 2 in the morning. They argued constantly about timelines, about methodology, about what to prioritize, about whether the cascade approach was sound, or whether a single catastrophic strike at the primary relay would be cleaner and faster. Jonas always came back to the cascade. He'd learned patience in a white room eating food that tasted like nothing, and he'd learned that the elegant thing, the thing built on its own logic, fails elegantly when you find the logic. You didn't need to be loud. You needed to be precise. Dr. Chen was the one who understood the architecture fastest. Her background was in signal propagation, and she thought in networks the way Jonas thought in mechanical systems. And between them, they built a model of the Vreth monitoring infrastructure that, by year 3, was more complete than anything the Vreth themselves maintained as a single document, because the Vreth didn't need a single complete document. The people who built each component knew their component, and the people who ran the network trusted the components. They'd never had reason to model the whole thing from the outside. Jonas and Dr. Chen had every reason. The port worked the way the doctor had described. In range of Vreth monitoring infrastructure, and they had monitoring infrastructure in the outer solar system. Subtle things, easy to miss if you didn't know what to look for. Jonas could push information out as well as receive it. He could also, with Dr. Chen's help, understand the architecture of the Vreth systems well enough to map them. The architecture was elegant. Elegant systems have elegant weaknesses. They depend on their own elegance, on the assumption that the logic will hold, that the pieces will fit the way they were designed to fit. He found 7 critical cascade points in the monitoring network. Each one, destabilized in the right sequence, would produce a predictable failure in the ones adjacent to it. You didn't need to break the whole system. You just needed to understand which piece, moved when, made the structure want to fall. He'd always been good at that. The problem was time, and the problem was Polidori. Polidori checked in. Not often. He was managing dozens of long-term assets and operations across multiple star systems. Jonas understood that from the data he was pulling through the port, but regularly. He sent monitoring pulses through the wrist port that were designed to confirm Jonas's location and basic physiological status, and he expected a compliant signal back. Jonas sent compliant signals back. This was the most delicate part. This was the part that required him to be 2 things at once, the thing Polidori thought he had, and the thing he actually was. He got good at it. He'd had practice, sitting in rooms with aliens who thought they knew what they were looking at. In the 4th year, Dr. Chen brought in 17 other people. In the 6th year, that was 300. By the 8th year, Jonas had stopped counting because it didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about the number. It was about the quality of what they'd built together in 8 years of working with the system's own logic against itself. They weren't a military force. They were something the Vreth threat assessment didn't have a number for because it had never occurred to them to look for it. a distributed, coordinated, highly motivated network of people who understood the enemy's infrastructure better than the enemy understood them. Polidori sent a communication in the 9th year. He was pleased with Jonas's reports. He noted that Earth's technological development had continued along predicted lines. He said the political process was nearly complete. He suggested it was time to discuss the next phase. Jonas sent back a compliant response. Then he went to the window. He had a different window now, in a different room in New Mexico, looking out at the desert, and he put his hand flat against the glass, and he stood there for a long time. He thought about the museum, the threat assessment column, the 6. He thought about the doctor's voice, when she said what we are about to do to your planet is not medicine. He thought about his wife's hand over his in the dark. He'd found her in the 2nd year. She hadn't known what happened to him. No one had. He'd simply disappeared, the kind of disappearance that produces grief without closure. And finding her had been the second hardest thing he'd ever done, because he'd had to decide first whether finding her put her in danger. He'd decided it did. He'd decided to find her anyway. She'd looked at him across a distance of about 15 feet and gone, very still. Then she'd covered that distance in a way that had nothing calculated about it at all. He'd said, "I know I look different." She'd said, "Shut up." She'd put her hand over his, and the weight of 9 missing years lifted, the same way it always did, and he'd held on to that in the years since the way he held on to everything that mattered. She'd come into the work eventually, not the technical work, that wasn't her field, but the human work, which turned out to be the harder part. The part where people needed to be kept together and reminded why they were doing what they were doing at 2 in the morning in a basement in Albuquerque when the work was grinding, and the timeline was uncertain, and the enemy was very large and very patient and very far away. She was better at that than anyone Jonas had ever known. He'd told her once, near the end of the 5th year, when a critical piece of their network mapping had failed, and they'd lost 3 months of work to a corrupted data structure, that he wasn't sure they could make this work. That the system was too large and their window too narrow and their resources too thin. She'd handed him a cup of tea, the one she always made and never finished, and she'd sat down next to him and she'd said, "You solved a puzzle in 40 seconds, in an alien room, on the first day. What are you actually worried about?" He'd looked at her. She'd said, "Finish your tea." He had. The morning of the day it ended began before dawn in 17 time zones simultaneously. Jonas sat in the communication center they'd built under the desert, and he looked at the faces of the people connected to him through every screen in the room. Engineers, physicists, communications specialists, 3 former intelligence officers who'd asked no questions they didn't already know the answer to. A retired general who'd become, over 6 years of working together, something between a colleague and a friend. He said, "We don't get to know if this works before we start. Once it starts, it runs or it doesn't." The retired general said, "When has that ever stopped us?" Jonas looked at the access sequence the doctor had given him. He'd long since memorized it. He'd memorized it in one pass 10 years ago, but he looked at the physical object anyway. A habit, a ritual. Like the necklace he still kept in his pocket, still carried, the way she'd told him he could. He pressed his palm to the port in his wrist. He felt the system open around him like a door being unlocked from the inside. The sensation he'd never gotten used to and stopped trying to. The cold rush of alien architecture against the warm architecture of his own mind. He pushed through it the way you push through cold water. Fast, with commitment, because hesitation is the thing that kills you. He found the first cascade point. He pushed. In the outer solar system, a monitoring node went dark. Not loudly, not in the way that broadcasts itself, not in a way that shows up on any alert as hostile action. In the way that a quiet systemic failure presents itself. A dropped signal, a lost connection, a gap in coverage that could be equipment failure, that would need to be investigated and repaired before any conclusion could be drawn. The investigation would take time. The repair would take more time. And the gap in coverage meant that, for a specific window of hours, the innermost solar system would be unwatched. 3 seconds after Jonas pushed, Dr. Chen's team began broadcasting on 17 frequencies simultaneously. Not a distress call, not a message. Data. The entire technical architecture of the Vreth monitoring system, mapped and annotated, transmitted outward toward every listening station humanity had ever built to watch for signals that didn't belong to Earth. It was not a weapon, it was a manual. Every researcher who'd spent their career looking for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence suddenly had, in their hands, a complete schematic of exactly what one looked like, where it was, how it worked, and what it was for. Jonas moved to the second cascade point, then the third. By the fourth, Polidori would know something was wrong. The monitoring signals from the wrist port would have shifted, the output patterns different, the compliant responses missing. By the fourth, there would be an alarm somewhere in the Vreth system, a flag on the asset file, a question being routed up the chain of command about what exactly was happening at the human experiment. Jonas pushed through the fourth faster than the previous 3. By the fifth, Polidori would have the answer to his question. By the sixth, it wouldn't matter. The seventh cascade point was the deepest one, the one buried in the primary communication relay that handled Vreth coordination across this sector of space. Jonas had mapped it in year 4 and spent year 5 understanding it, and years 6 through 8 understanding it better, because you don't push the last domino in a chain until you know exactly where every piece falls. He reached it and he felt the architecture pulse, felt something that wasn't quite resistance, wasn't quite alarm, more like the system registering a variable it hadn't been designed to accommodate, and he held still in it for 3 seconds. He thought about the threat assessment, the 6. He thought about what a 6 meant to the Vreth, a species with sufficient capacity for violence to require managed integration, dangerous enough to monitor, not dangerous enough to worry about. He thought about what a 6 didn't capture, the thing that made humans genuinely hard to account for, which was not the capacity for violence, which every species with survival instincts has, but the capacity for the specific combination of patience and stubbornness and love that makes a man spend 10 years in careful preparation, rather than a moment in futile revolt. The thing that makes a woman hand a potential weapon to the very creature that represents everything that's wrong with what she's agreed to do. The thing that makes 2 people find each other across 9 years and 15 feet, and stand there without words because none are necessary. None of the Vreth models had a number for that. He pushed. The 7th cascade point went. The silence that followed was not the silence of his first morning in the White Room. It was the silence of something resolved, a gear click, a lock engaging, the particular silence of a system reaching its new equilibrium. In the outer solar system, across 17 monitoring nodes, the Vreth network experienced a cascading failure of a type and pattern that their diagnostic systems would recognize as, and spend considerable time investigating as, internal equipment failure. The gap in coverage would be brief. But in that gap the data was already moving, had been moving for 4 minutes, would continue moving for hours. The data was not just a map. Jonas and Dr. Chen had spent the last 3 years ensuring that the data was also a key, embedded within the technical specifications of the Vreth monitoring architecture, were the exact access sequences, the exact protocol structures, the exact cascade logic that would allow any sufficiently motivated and technically capable civilization to do what Jonas had just done. Not a weapon, a manual. The Vreth Collective had spent 14 months remaking Jonas' rays into the most effective intelligence asset they'd ever produced. They had not considered that the most effective thing you can do with a map of the enemy's defenses is share it. He sat back. His hand was still against the wrist port, the connection still open, and he could feel the system through it, quieter now, the cascade complete, the network in its new configuration. He looked at the faces in the screens around him, exhausted, waiting, the expression of people who have done the thing and are waiting to understand what the thing has done. He said, "That's all 7. Dr. Chen said, "Confirmed, the data is broadcasting." He said, "How long until they know?" She said, "The gap closes in about 6 hours. After that," she paused, "after that is their problem." Their problem. The Vreth Collective's problem, which was that they had spent a decade watching Earth's technological development along predicted lines, and had not accounted for the significant difference between what humans develop when they don't know they're being watched, and what humans develop when a very motivated, very patient, very angry husband spends 9 years handing them the exact specifications of the lock on the door. The general said from his corner of the screen, "What happens now?" Jonas said, "Now we wait, and we build. 12 years was their estimate. It's probably less now. They'll accelerate when they understand what happened. But we know the system. We know the weak points, and every other civilization in this sector now knows what we know." He paused. He said, "We're not going to fight them the way they expect to be fought. We're not ranked 6 because we're a military threat. We're ranked 6 because we're unpredictable." He looked at the port in his wrist. "I want us to stay unpredictable." Dr. Chen said, "Agreed." The general said, "Agreed." The screens began to quiet, connections closing one by one as people dispersed to other tasks, to sleep, to the particular private moment that follows the end of a long thing. Jonas sat in the emptying room and looked at his hands. He went home. He drove with the windows down. The desert air in the dark before dawn was cool and smelled of sage and distant rain, the particular smell of New Mexico that he had grown, over 9 years in the state, to associate with everything that mattered to him now. The notebooks, the late nights, the borrowed server rooms, the general's dry humor, Dr. Chen's certainty. He'd spent his life before this moving through systems, the logic of machines, the logic of engineered solutions, and what this decade had taught him was that the most important system was always the human one, the one that ran not on design protocols but on stubbornness and love, and the particular obstinacy of people who have decided that something matters enough to work for it without knowing if the work will land. The Vreth had tried to make a tool out of a person. The mistake was category level. Tools are defined by their purpose, and their purpose is set by whoever holds them. A person sets their own purpose. His had been set 14 months into a white room, the moment he'd pressed his forehead to the glass and looked out at a city that was not his and said, "I'm going to figure this out." He drove home. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges when he pulled up, the first thin line of pale gold above the mountains east of the valley. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, listening to the desert settle into its version of morning quiet insect sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the faint breath of wind across sage. He thought about the doctor, somewhere impossibly far away, and hoped she'd had the courage to go somewhere safe before things got complicated. He thought about Polidori, and hoped he was exactly where he was when the 7th cascade point hit, mid-sentence, mid-confidence, mid-assumption that the thing he'd built was the thing he thought he'd built. She was awake. She'd been awake since before dawn, tracking the communications she had access to, which wasn't everything but was enough to understand the shape of what was happening. When he came in, she was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't finished, and she looked up at him, and the kitchen light fell across her the way it always had and always would. He sat down across from her. He put the necklace on the table between them. The charm caught the kitchen light. She said, "Did it work?" He said, "We'll know more in 6 hours." She nodded. She wrapped both hands around her tea. He reached across and put his hand over hers, the right hand, the one with the 3 ridges, the one that was wrong in a deeper way than surface difference, and she turned her hand over without looking and laced her fingers through his. The morning came through the kitchen window in the slow way mornings do in the desert, light arriving in increments, the sky moving through a series of colors that were not violet green, that were precisely and specifically the colors of an earth morning. And Jonah's Rays sat in his kitchen with his wife's hand in his, and the weight of everything lifted. Outside on 17 frequencies, the manual was still transmitting. The Vreth Collective had their threat assessment. They had their 6. They had their 14 months of data on what a human being could do when rebuilt and monitored and managed. They had not yet recalculated for what a human being could do when handed a weapon and given enough time to learn how to use it, and enough reason, and a kitchen, and a cup of tea gone cold, and a hand to hold in the dark. They would need to recalculate. He was already looking forward to watching them try.